So I have two more issues that Jackson tackled during his presidency, and I'm going to break them up into two separate parts of lecture video. This means that they'll be a little bit shorter, but if I were to put them together, I think the video would be a bit too long. So let's talk about Indian removal. There's a reason why the second part of the lecture notes has the Democracy for All ? As the title. Because we've seen Jackson want to expand democracy for many Americans. We've seen him tackle nullification. And here we're going to see exactly what he means by who should be an American and who should see an expansion of democracy. President Jackson's forcible removal of Indians from their ancestral lands was his highest priority and one of his lowest moments. Like most white frontiersmen, he saw Indians as barbarians who were to be treated as subjects, not nations. He claimed that Indians and land-hungry white settlers could never live in harmony, so the Indians had to go if they were to survive. Henry Clay felt the same way, arguing that the Indians were, quote, destined to extinction and not worth preserving. After Jackson's election in 1828, he urged that the remaining eastern Indians, east of the Mississippi River, that is, be moved to reservations west of the Mississippi in what became Oklahoma. Jackson believed that moving the Indians would serve their best interests as well as the national interests. For the states in the lower South, especially the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama, were aggressively restricting the rights of Indian nations and taking their land. Jackson often told Indian leaders that he was their great father, trying to protect them from greedy state governments. He claimed that relocating the eastern Indians was a, quote, wise and humane policy that would save them from utter annihilation if they tried to hold on to their lands in the face of state actions. In 1830, Jackson submitted to Congress the Indian Removal Act, which authorized him to ignore commitments made by previous presidents and to convince the Indians remaining in the East and South to move to federal lands west of the Mississippi River. The federal government, the new program promised, would pay for the Indian exodus and give them initial support in their new lands in Oklahoma. The law marked a rejection of the Jeffersonian idea that civilized Indians could be assimilated into the American population. Indian leaders were skeptical. As a federal agent reported, quote, they see that our professions are insincere, that our promises are broken, and that the happiness of the Indian is a cheap sacrifice to the acquisition of new lands, end quote. Jackson's proposal also provoked heated opposition among reformers, who distrusted his motives and doubted the promised support of the federal government. Critics flooded Congress with petitions that criticized the policy and warned that Jackson's plan would bring enduring shame on the nation. But to no avail. In late May 1830, the Senate passed the Indian Removal Act by a single vote, and Jackson eagerly signed it. The Cherokees responded by announcing that, quote, we see nothing but ruin before us. The so-called 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, with a population of around 60,000 living in North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, were uprooted as a result. The Cherokee Nation tried to defy the federal removal policy. Cherokees had long occupied northwest Georgia and the mountainous areas of northern Alabama, eastern Tennessee, and western North Carolina. In 1827, relying upon their established treaty rights, they adopted a constitution as an independent nation in which they declared that they were not subject to the laws or control of any state or federal government. Georgia officials had other ideas. The discovery of gold in North Georgia in 1829 had increased whites' lust for Cherokee land, attracted trespassing prospectors, and led to a new law under which Cherokees would not be allowed to vote, own property, or testify against whites in court. It also prohibited Cherokees from digging for gold on their own lands. The Cherokees sought relief in the Supreme Court, arguing that, quote, we wish to remain on the land of our fathers. We have a perfect and original right to remain without interruption or molestation." End quote. In the case Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the Cherokees had an unquestionable right to maintain control of their ancestral lands, but the court could not render a verdict because of a technicality. The Cherokees had filed suit as a foreign nation. In Marshall's view, they were domestic dependent nations. If it were true that wrongs have been inflicted, Marshall explained, this is not the tribunal which can redress the past or prevent the future. The following year, the Supreme Court did rule in favor of the Cherokees in Worcester versus Georgia. The case arose when Georgia officials arrested a group of white Christian missionaries who were living among the Cherokees in violation of a state law forbidding such interaction. Two of the missionaries, Samuel Worcester and Elihu Butler, were sentenced to 4 years hard labor. They appealed to the Supreme Court. In the Worcester case, John Marshall said the missionaries must be released. The anti-Cherokee laws passed by the Georgia legislature, he declared, had violated, quote, the Constitution, laws, and treaties of the United States, end quote. He declared that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community within which Georgia law had no force. President Jackson, however, refused to enforce the court's decision, claiming that he had no constitutional authority to intervene in Georgia. Thereafter, Jackson gave the Cherokees and other Indian nations a terrible choice: either abide by discriminatory new laws or relocate to federal lands west of the Mississippi River, which would be theirs, quote, forever. The irony of the new Georgia policy was that of all the southern tribes, the Cherokee had come closest to adopting the customs of white America. They had abandoned traditional hunting practices to develop farms, build roads, schools, and churches, and create trading posts and newspapers. Many Cherokees married whites, adopted their clothing and food, and converted to Christianity. And the Cherokees owned some 2,000 enslaved African Americans. In 1838, after President Jackson had left office and Martin Van Buren was president, 18,000 men, women, and children were evicted and moved west under military guard on the Trail of Tears, an 800-mile forced journey marked by the harshness of soldiers and the neglect of irresponsible private contractors assigned to manage the process. Some 4,000 refugees died along the way. For his part, Van Buren told Congress in December 1838 that he took, quote, sincere pleasure in reporting that the entire Cherokee Nation had been relocated. The Trail of Tears, according to a white Georgian, was, quote, the cruelest work I ever knew. A few Cherokees held out in the mountains of North Carolina. They became known as the Eastern Band of Cherokees. The Creeks and Chickasaws followed the Trail of Tears a few years later after Alabama and Mississippi took control of their tribal lands. So that is Jackson and Indian removal. The final part of our video is going to focus on Jackson and the Bank War.